The graves had been opened from the inside. That's what it looked like. I know how that sounds. But I need you to understand what I mean, because I don't mean it the way you're thinking. I don't mean something crawled out. I mean someone had dug narrow channels from the surface down into each grave and then carefully repacked the earth to look undisturbed. Except they hadn't done it well enough. The soil had settled over time, and now each grave had a long, shallow depression running from the headstone down to roughly where the chest cavity would be. Like a vein, like each body had a line running to it. My name is Logan Pierce. I do freelance land survey work across western Kansas. A company out of Wichita had contracted me to map a parcel in Greeley County, 160 acres of nothing that someone wanted to subdivide for wind turbine leasing. The old church and cemetery sat on the northwest corner of the parcel, and I needed to establish the boundary of the cemetery plot so it could be excluded from the lease agreement. Simple work, a day job, maybe two. That was supposed to be the extent of my involvement with that place. The church sat about 11 miles south of Tribune, down a county road that turned to dirt after the first 2 miles. You drive west on that dirt road, and then there's a turn that isn't marked, just 2 ruts cutting north through buffalo grass and thistle. You follow those ruts for about a 1/4 mile, and the church appears on a low rise, the only structure in any direction to the horizon. It was a wood frame building, white originally, though by the time I saw it, the paint had weathered down to bare gray timber on the south and west walls. The north side still held some white in patches, like the memory of what it had been. Single room, maybe 30 feet by 50. A small bell tower on the front, though the bell was gone. The front doors were plank oak, and they were closed but not locked. There was no lock. There was no handle. Just a smooth place on the wood where thousands of hands had pushed their way in over the decades. The cemetery was behind the church, on the north slope of the rise. 27 graves. I counted them that first morning. The oldest stone I could read dated to 1891. The newest was 1964. After that, nothing. The church and its dead had simply been left behind when the community dried up and the families moved on. Or that's what I assumed. I started my survey work at the southeast corner of the cemetery and moved methodically along the boundary. That's when I noticed the depressions. Not on every grave. On 9 of them. 9 graves with those long, sunken channels in the soil, running lengthwise, headstone to center. I told myself it was natural settling, coffin collapse, soil compression, the ordinary physics of decay. I'd seen disturbed graves before on survey jobs, but this was different. The depressions were too narrow, too uniform. Each one was roughly 4 inches wide, maybe 2 inches deep, and they all ran the same direction, from the head end down. I photographed them for my survey notes and kept working. It was around noon when I went into the church for the first time. I needed shade to eat my lunch and check my data on the laptop. The door swung inward easily, and the smell hit me before my eyes adjusted. Not rot, not mildew, something chemical. Sharp and faintly sweet, like preservative, like formaldehyde, though I didn't place it immediately. I just thought, that shouldn't be here. The interior was stripped. Pews were gone. The floor was bare planking, warped and buckled in places with lines of old nail holes where the pews had been anchored. The pulpit was still there, a simple wooden stand at the far end. Behind it, a window, the only window that still had glass, and through it the cemetery was visible. The graves fanned out in the frame of that window like the church was built to watch over them. I set up at the back of the room, near the doors, and ate. That's when I noticed the floor, the warped planking I mentioned. It wasn't all damage from weather and time. Some of the boards had been pried up and replaced. You could see it in the nail pattern. The original nails were square-cut, old, rusted to black. But in a section near the center of the room, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, the nails were modern. Round wire nails, galvanized. They hadn't even rusted yet. Someone had opened this floor recently. I finished my sandwich. I sat there looking at those nails for a long time. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think most people would have done the same thing. I got my pry bar from the truck. The boards came up easily. They'd been placed, not secured with any real force. Beneath them was a shallow crawl space, maybe 2 feet deep, with dry packed earth at the bottom. And in that earth, arranged very neatly, were jars. Mason jars. Maybe 24 of them, lined up in rows. Each one was sealed. Each one contained a dark liquid. And floating in that liquid, in each jar, were small objects that I couldn't identify at first because of the tint of the fluid. I picked one up. It was heavy. The glass was cold even though the air in the church was warm. I held it up to the light from the doorway. Teeth. The jar was full of human teeth. Dozens of them, suspended in brownish fluid, molars and incisors and canines all mixed together. Some still had roots attached, long and curved and stained dark. I put the jar down very carefully. I looked at the others. They weren't all the same. Some held teeth. Some held what looked like small bones. Finger bones, I thought, though I'm not a medical professional. One jar, near the back of the row, held something I couldn't identify. Something soft and folded. I didn't pick that one up. I didn't want to know. I replaced the boards. I drove back to Tribune. I sat in the parking lot of the gas station for about 20 minutes. Then I called the Greeley County Sheriff's Office. A deputy named Harlan Bryce met me at the church the next morning. He was maybe 60, lean, sun-weathered, and he drove out in a personal truck, not a cruiser. He didn't seem surprised by the location. When I showed him the floor, he knelt down and looked at the jars without touching them. He was quiet for a long time. "These graves," I said. "9 of them have been disturbed. You can see the settling from channels dug down into them." He looked at me then. "Which 9? I showed him my survey photos on the laptop. I'd marked each one. He studied the names on the headstones in the photographs, and his expression didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes. Recognition. He knew those names. "I'm going to ask you to leave the property for today," he said. "I'll make some calls." I asked if he wanted me to wait. He said no. He said it firmly enough that I understood it wasn't a suggestion. I went back to my motel in Tribune. I waited. Nobody called. The next morning, I drove back to the site because I still had survey work to finish and a contract to fulfill. Harlan Bryce's truck was not there. But something had changed. The floor in the church had been repaired. Not just the boards replaced, the nails had been swapped. Old square-cut nails now held the boards down, matching the rest of the floor. If I hadn't seen it myself the day before, I would never have known those boards had been touched. The jars were gone, all of them. I went out to the cemetery. The 9 depressions were still there, but someone had spread loose dirt over them and tamped it down. A casual observer would see nothing. But I had photographs. I had coordinates. I called the sheriff's office. Harlan Bryce was not available. I left a message. He never returned it. I finished my survey work that afternoon. I was measuring the northwest boundary of the cemetery when I found the path. It wasn't visible from the church side. You had to walk around to the back of the cemetery, past the oldest graves, and there, behind a thicket of wild plum that had grown up along a collapsed fence line, a narrow footpath led down the back of the rise and into a shallow draw. The path was worn, packed earth, smooth, no grass growing on it. Someone used this path regularly. I followed it for about 200 yards. The draw deepened, and the walls rose to maybe 8 feet on either side. Cottonwoods grew along a dry creek bed. And there, against the east bank of the draw, half hidden by the trees, was a dugout. Not a cave, a dugout. Hand excavated, a door made of plywood, painted the same gray as the dead grass on the surrounding hillside. You could stand 20 feet away and not see it. I only saw it because the path led directly to it. The door was padlocked, a heavy padlock, new. The hasp was bolted into a wooden frame set into the earthen wall. I put my ear close to the door and listened. Nothing. No sound. But air was moving. I could feel a faint draft coming from the gap beneath the door, and it carried that same smell from inside the church. The chemical sweetness, formaldehyde. Stronger here, much stronger. I stepped back. I looked at the ground in front of the door. Boot prints in the dry soil. Multiple visits. Multiple sizes, or the same boots over time, the treads wearing down. I couldn't tell. But someone came here often. I took photographs. I took GPS coordinates. I walked back to my truck and I left. This time I didn't call the sheriff. I called the Kansas Bureau of Investigation field office in Garden City. I explained what I'd found. I emailed the photographs. The woman I spoke to was professional and direct. She said someone would follow up. 4 days later, I received a call from a KBI agent named Toomey. He told me, in a voice that was very measured and very careful, that they had visited the site. He thanked me for reporting it. And then he said something that I've turned over in my mind every day since. The site has been cleared, he said. There's nothing there that constitutes evidence of a crime at this time. I asked about the jars. He said he couldn't comment on specifics. I asked about the dugout. He paused, then he said, "The structure you described was not located during our visit." I told him I had GPS coordinates. I told him I had photographs of the door, the path, the padlock. He said he appreciated the information and that the case was under review. That was 13 months ago. Nobody has contacted me since. I did go back, once. 3 months after my last conversation with Agent Toomey, I told myself I needed to verify my survey data for the final filing. That was true, but it wasn't why I went. The church was the same. The floor was undisturbed. The cemetery looked ordinary. The 9 depressions had disappeared completely. The soil had been carefully graded and reseeded. Fresh grass was growing in even lines over those graves. Someone had tended them. I walked behind the cemetery to find the path. It was gone. The wild plum thicket had been cut back and the area cleared. Where the path had been, there was just open grass and bare ground. I walked the draw anyway, following my GPS to the exact coordinates of the dugout. The bank was smooth, undisturbed earth, no door, no frame, no padlock. The cottonwoods were there, the dry creek bed was there, but the dugout had been filled in and the surface graded to match the surrounding terrain. If I hadn't stood in that exact spot 3 months earlier, I would have said nothing had ever been there. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. When I walked back through the cemetery that last time, I counted the graves again. I'd counted 27 on my first visit. I'd logged them. I had each one recorded with coordinates and headstone data. There were 29 graves now, 2 new ones. At the far edge of the plot, tucked against the fence line, fresh earth, carefully mounded in the old style, but with no headstones, no markers of any kind. The soil was dark and recently turned, and running from the head of each mound down toward the center, a narrow, shallow depression, 4 inches wide, 2 inches deep. The same channels, the same pattern, the same vein running down into the earth. I stood there looking at those 2 new graves in the late afternoon light, and I understood something that I didn't want to understand. This wasn't historical. This wasn't something that had happened years ago and ended. Someone was still using this cemetery. Someone was still burying people here, in the old way, in the old plot, behind a church that the rest of the world had forgotten existed. And whoever it was, whoever had removed the jars, filled in the dugout, reseeded the grass, replaced the nails, graded the earth, they were maintaining this place. Carefully, deliberately, they were tending to it the way you tend to something that matters to you deeply. I got in my truck, I drove to the county road, and just before I turned south toward Tribune, I looked in my rearview mirror, back toward the rise where the church stood against the open sky. There was someone standing in the bell tower, just a shape, a silhouette in the empty frame where the bell had been. A person standing very still, watching me leave. I could not make out a face. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. They did not move. They just stood there, framed in that dark opening, and watched. I drove away. I filed my survey. I closed the contract. I have never gone back. But some nights I open my laptop and look at the photographs I took, the jars, the teeth floating in that brown fluid, the plywood door painted the color of dead grass. And I look at the last photo I took that day, the one from my truck window, zoomed in on the bell tower. The shape is there, the figure is there. And in the low resolution of the image, in the grain and the shadow, I can almost convince myself that the figure is smiling. But I will never be sure, and that is the part that doesn't let me sleep.